In these last two training sessions on HR, we're privileged to have with us a good friend of mine and a special guest, Mike Dobert. Mike is the owner of HR and Alignment. Mike has 30 years experience in the HR field, both in corporations and in small business. The last 10 years, he has owned this company, HR and Alignment. And Mike, you do a lot of consulting and coaching with business owners around the HR aspect of their business. Tell us a little bit specifically more about what you do with HR and Alignment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn. HR and Alignment is really, the concept is like an outsourced HR director. And so working with clients both on the compliance side of making sure they have the right handbook, job descriptions, you think of wage and hour laws, EO training. But then there's also the strategic side of HR where you're looking at an organization's goals and really making sure to align individual efforts with organizational goals. And so performance management systems that really kind of tie those two pieces together, compensation design that drive business outcomes. I think you're a great speaker on leadership, and I think that's an important component as well, tying it in that level of leadership at the individual level. And so those are some of the key components. But it's very much a concierge type service, more hands-on. It's not just a call center, it's sitting down. And I think the final point I would make on this is so important to always look at the HR side of things, but also understand the business aspect. A lot of times business owners want to do the right thing, but things don't fit necessarily in a tidy box. So how can they minimize their risk, make sure they're following the laws, but also balance with a good business decision? And that's where the hands-on approach comes from.
I've heard you several times say to clients, because you work with several of my clients,
Sure.
and you talk about in the perfect HR world, it's like this, but in reality in small businesses, here's how it typically plays out. So one of the things I've appreciated is your understanding and flexibility, but yet at the same time making sure we stay within the proper limits of law and compliance requirements.
Absolutely.
And so one of the questions that comes up frequently is, how do we attract talent? How do we hire people and keep people? Tell us a little bit about some of the best practices you're seeing and you're advising around talent acquisition.
That's a great question, Glenn. Thank you. I think one of the things that sits in front of that is, where are you looking for that talent? And some of the traditional avenues, such as job posting boards, Monster, Indeed, are great resources. But I've also found a lot of clients using LinkedIn and some of those to look for passive job seekers, those people that aren't actively looking for a job, but they're talent in the marketplace. And so LinkedIn and other resources has good tools to be able to actively search through their database, if you will, and perhaps reach out to someone that otherwise isn't looking for a job. And so that becomes one of the biggest things. I think from there, other than sourcing your talent, it really comes back to the hiring piece of it, or the talent acquisition piece, which you say wisely. And part of it's starting with a well-written job description, or call it job design. So you clearly understand the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you're looking for. Something I also like to tie into that, an organization will have KPIs, key performance indicators. But above and beyond the job itself, for each position, what are those KPIs? What are those 2 or 3? That may be customer service administrative, but accuracy, turn time, a number of things. Where does it really roll up to? So I think that is the key thing to start with as foundation. Beyond that, as you tend to go into the interview process, a lot of times you're having a phone conversation. So you've gotten some applications or resumes perhaps. Perhaps they don't have the application at that point. But to me, that first interview is a qualifying interview. Do you have the knowledge, skills, and abilities? Does it appear you've applied competencies that we could use to add value to our organization? But moving past that, generally you'll have a second interview. And there's no certain number of interviews, but generally there's a second interview that's in person. And to me, that's where I like to change from what may have started with closed-ended questions, qualifying questions, do you have this level of experience, yes or no, to open-ended questions, which include, with open-ended, are behavioral interviewing techniques or situational. What would you do in this situation? And so in that, you're thinking, what are some of the things I really want this person at the top of the end of the day to really come in and be able to add value on? And so you can really guide that discussion. If you were given this scenario, what would you do? If a customer asked you to go to do something against company policy, what would you do? What is the thought process to observing company policy, but at the same time, taking care of the customer? And so that's one of the things that's very, very important.
I've seen you in interviews
Yeah.
use the behavioral interview technique. where you ask them questions like, "Tell me about a time when."
Yes.
Say just briefly something about that, because I think that's a powerful interviewing technique.
It is, and I appreciate that. It gives some insight. One of the questions I love to ask is, tell me about one of your most meaningful failures, professional failures. I want to make sure we keep focused on the business side of it, not get into personal things.
Yeah.
And what'd you learn from it?
Oh, that's excellent.
And it's amazing. I've had people answer from everything, with great respect to them, that, well, I've never had a failure. Well, okay, perhaps you've been fortunate. But then I've had other people share heartfelt stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I look for that humbleness and that transparency that shows that someone's willing to be vulnerable. We all know with team development, team interactions, the foundation of that is the ability to trust and be vulnerable.
Yes.
And that builds to cohesive teams. So that's a big part of it. One of the things I like to do, and it's kind of the slow to hire premise, but it is true, is sometimes there's an opportunity for a third interview. Whoever's hired is going to come in and work with a team. And so a peer panel interview.
Ooh, that sounds
Now,
good.
one of the things I'll share, I think anybody watching this, and you would certainly tell me the same thing and have, is making sure that if you're going to have a team of peers create a panel, have they been versed a little bit as to what to ask, what not to ask, what questions you're going to ask, just to make sure we're keeping things legal and on the right side of things.
Sure.
One last thing I'd like to mention in the interview process that I really like, and this is the opportunity to say, you've talked about your knowledge, skills, and abilities, but let me see if you have the ability to apply your competencies. So an example could be a salesperson, where you've gone through the interview process, you feel you have the right person, and the last step is, for you perhaps, Glenn, you're a great candidate. We've talked about the requirements of the position, and as a sales professional coming in, if you're willing, I'd like for you to prepare a strategic sales plan. I know it may not have all the details as you're not yet working in the position, but just to see, and what I'm looking for in that is to see if Glenn, for example, is going to understand the real components of a strategic sales plan. Who are your channel partners, these sort of things, and real specific targets. I'm not worried about the details, but the framework. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times people come in and say, well, gosh, I'm going to go hit that road and get at it. Well, that's wonderful. But do they really have a strategic approach? So the other thing I would share there is the use of assessments. And so there's a lot of different assessments, disc profile, a lot of different things that are used for team building as well. But one that I've used before without favoring one over the other, Profile XT, that usually benchmarks an incumbent. And so these are the characteristics, the talent sets. How was that person compared on that benchmark?
That makes sense.
And so those are some things around talent acquisition, from understanding what you're hiring for and really using that interview process and not rushing through it and having a behavioral part of it, and then the team of peers that are well trained again. But that's going to have a good introduction into the team that they had part of that selection process.
Well, Mike, this has been so helpful to our people, I know, to hear your thoughts and practices around hiring and talent acquisition. We're going to interview Mike some more, and you'll learn more about some of these best practices around HR. But we'll take these things you've shared about talent acquisition, I hope, and put them into practice in our businesses.